The sun hammered down on Redemption Valley, Arizona, like a divine sentence. Dust devils danced in the late afternoon light as townsfolk clustered outside the small auction house, a recent, somewhat incongruous addition to a town barely clinging to civilization. The year was 1885, and the railroad had brought both riches and ruthless men to this corner of the territory. Thomas Harlow stood at the rear of the crowd, his weathered hands betraying a slight tremor, a near-constant companion these days. At 62, the former Union Army captain, tall and lean with a silver beard, cut a dignified, if somewhat diminished, figure. His eyes, however, held the weight of too much death, a darkness that never fully lifted. He watched, silent and stony-faced, as the auctioneer held up the final painting. "Next lot, ladies and gentlemen, a landscape by our local artist," the auctioneer, a sweaty man named Dobbs, said, hesitating almost imperceptibly on the word artist, drawing snickers from several men near the front. "Depicting, well, I suppose it's Apache Pass with some figures." The painting, though small, was striking. Vibrant colors captured the raw beauty of the Arizona landscape at sunset, featuring two figures standing hand in hand against the fading light. One was clearly a white woman, the other a Native American man. "Shall we start the bidding at $1?" Dobbs asked, his voice wavering slightly as Warren Blackwood pushed his way to the front of the crowd. Blackwood commanded attention effortlessly, a broad-shouldered man, immaculately dressed in an expensive black suit despite the oppressive heat. A silver watch chain draped ostentatiously across his vest. At 55, the wealthiest man in 3 counties exuded power like an overpowering cologne, too strong, impossible to ignore. "I'll give you 50 cents, Blackwood drawled, prompting more laughter. "For trash?" Thomas's hands clenched into fists, but he remained silent. 50 cents from Mr. Blackwood," Dobbs announced nervously. "Do I hear a higher bid?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several people glanced at Thomas, then quickly looked away. No one spoke. 50 cents going once, going twice. "Sold to Mr. Blackwood." Thomas watched as Blackwood took the painting, held it up for the crowd to see, and smiled, a cruel, mirthless expression. "Behold, friends, the great Thomas Harlow's masterpiece," Blackwood announced, his voice cutting through the dusty air. "A white woman and her lover. Is this what you fought for in the war, Captain? Is this what my men died for?" Without waiting for an answer, Blackwood withdrew a match from his vest pocket, struck it against his boot heel, and touched the flame to the corner of the canvas. The painting ignited quickly, hungry flames consuming Thomas's work as the crowd gasped. "Some things," Blackwood said, dropping the burning canvas to the dirt, "don't deserve to exist." Thomas felt something break inside him. Not his heart, which had shattered 3 years ago when he found Sarah's body, but something deeper, something primal. He stepped forward, pushing through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the burning painting. "That was the last image of my daughter," he said, his voice remarkably steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And her husband." Blackwood's smile didn't waver. "Your daughter chose to lie with an animal, and animals aren't husbands." The crowd fell silent. Even in Redemption Valley, where Blackwood's word was practically law, this crossed a line. Thomas Harlow was still respected, if pitied, by most of the town. "You speak of animals," Thomas said quietly, "yet I see only one here." Blackwood moved with surprising speed for a man his size. His hand shot out, grabbing Thomas by his worn shirt collar, yanking him close. "You've forgotten your place, old man." That's when Thomas saw it. As Blackwood's sleeve pulled back, a distinctive scar on his forearm was revealed. 3 parallel lines, like claw marks, but too precise, too intentional. Thomas had seen that scar before in James Miller's description of the man who had attacked him and Sarah months before they disappeared. "I know exactly what my place is," Thomas replied, his eyes locked on the scar. "And I know what you did." Something flickered across Blackwood's face, surprise, perhaps, or concern, before his mask of contempt returned. He shoved Thomas backward, sending the older man stumbling into the dirt. "Clean yourself up, Captain," Blackwood spat. "Your glory days are long past." Sheriff Dixon stepped forward, a man caught between duty and self-preservation. "That's enough, Warren. Let's not make a scene." Blackwood straightened his already immaculate jacket. "There's no scene, Sheriff. Just reminding an old fool that this town has standards." The crowd began to disperse, no one wanting to witness further humiliation or risk Blackwood's attention. Thomas pushed himself to his feet, brushing dust from his clothes with as much dignity as he could muster. His eyes never left Blackwood's face. "7 days," Thomas said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. Blackwood paused. "What did you say?" "7 days," Thomas repeated, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket. With deliberate movements, he tied a single knot in it. "In 7 days, I will take back everything you stole." Laughter erupted from Blackwood, echoed nervously by his associates. "And how will you manage that, old man, with your shaking hands and worthless paintings?" Thomas tied the knot tighter. "You'll see. 1 day at a time." As Blackwood turned away, still chuckling, Thomas noticed a small figure standing at the edge of the crowd. A boy, no more than 8 or 9, with dark hair and striking blue eyes that seemed hauntingly familiar. The child stared at Thomas with an intensity that belied his age, then melted away into the alley as Sheriff Dixon approached. "That was foolish, Thomas," Dixon said quietly. He was a head shorter than Thomas, with a drooping moustache and eyes that rarely met anyone's gaze directly. "Blackwood isn't a man who forgives slights." "I'm well past caring about forgiveness or slights," Thomas replied, tucking the knotted handkerchief into his pocket. "Some debts can only be paid in full." Dixon shifted uncomfortably, his fingers brushing the badge on his chest, as if to remind himself of its presence. "Look, I was your sergeant in the war. I respect you. That's why I'm telling you to let this go. Whatever you think Blackwood did—" "I don't think, I know," Thomas cut him off, his voice sharp as flint striking steel. "The question is, what do you know, John? And how long have you been pretending not to know it?" Dixon's face paled. "I have a wife, Thomas. Children." "So did I," Thomas replied. "Now I have graves." He left Dixon standing in the street, the smell of the burned canvas still lingering in the air. Thomas walked with purpose, not toward his small cabin at the edge of town, but to the livery stable where Blackwood kept his prize stallion, a magnificent black beast called Thunder, that Blackwood had won in a card game no one quite remembered the details of. Thomas paused across the street, watching as Blackwood's men tended to the horse. From his vantage point, he could see into the rear of the stable where a familiar figure worked in the shadows, the boy with the blue eyes. The child glanced up, meeting Thomas's gaze again, This time Thomas was certain those eyes belonged to Sarah. His granddaughter's eyes in a boy's face. Before Thomas could approach, Martha Wilcox hurried toward him, her apron still dusted with flour from the boarding-house kitchen. She ran. "Mr. Harlow," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder, "you shouldn't be out here. Not after." She gestured vaguely toward the auction house. "I'm fine, Martha," Thomas assured her, though they both knew it was a lie. "The boy brought you something," she whispered, pressing a small package wrapped in cloth into his hands. "Said you'd understand when you saw it." Thomas unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a small piece of wood, intricately carved with patterns. He recognized immediately the distinctive style of James Miller, Sarah's husband, who had been the most skilled woodworker in 3 territories before he vanished. "Where did he find this?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. "In Blackwood's storehouse," Martha replied. "The boy's been working odd jobs around town. Sees things." "Who is he?" Martha hesitated. "He calls himself Samuel. Arrived about a month ago. Won't say where he's from. Samuel, the name James and Sarah had chosen if their child was a boy." Thomas closed his fingers around the carved wood, feeling the patterns press into his palm. "Thank you, Martha," he said. "You should get back before you're missed." She nodded, then hesitated. "Mr. Harlow, whatever you're planning, Blackwood has eyes everywhere, and he controls the water. In this drought, that's everything." Thomas watched as Blackwood emerged from the auction house, flanked by his 2 most loyal men, Reynolds, a thin, sharp-faced former cavalry scout, and Carter, a bull-necked enforcer who rarely spoke. "Sometimes, Martha, a man finds himself in the desert with nothing left to lose," Thomas said quietly. "That's when he becomes dangerous." As darkness fell across Redemption Valley, Thomas made his way to the communal well that Blackwood had claimed as his own 3 summers ago when the drought began. Now townsfolk paid double what water was worth, and those who couldn't pay went thirsty. The well stood unguarded for the moment, a rare opportunity. Thomas approached silently, removed a small object from his pocket, and dropped it into the depths. The soft splash was barely audible. "Day 1, he whispered. "I take your water." From the shadows across the street, Reynolds watched, a smile spreading across his thin face. The old man was making it almost too easy. Meanwhile, high on the hill overlooking the town, in the grand house Blackwood had built as a monument to his success, a strange sound echoed through the empty halls, the laughter of a woman, coming from a locked room where no one was supposed to be. Thomas woke before dawn in his small cabin, the familiar ache in his joints, a reminder of age and old wounds. On the wall hung a single painting. Sarah as a child, sitting on the porch of their home in Pennsylvania before the war, called him away. Beside it was an empty space where James had hung a carved wooden frame he'd made for their wedding portrait. With hands that shook less in the cool morning air, Thomas began to paint, not for sale, not for show, but with purpose, precision, and rage. As the sun crept over the horizon, he completed a small canvas showing Blackwood's prize stallion, broken free, running wild. At the bottom he inscribed, "Day 1." The town was already buzzing when Thomas arrived at the general store. Martha caught his eye from across the street and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Following her gaze, Thomas spotted Sheriff Dixon standing outside the livery stable, which was surrounded by Blackwood's men in a state of obvious agitation. "What's happened?" Thomas asked innocently as he approached. Dixon gave him a searching look. "Blackwood's horse broke loose overnight. Valuable animal." "How unfortunate," Thomas replied. "Did it simply wander off?" "Halter was cut," Dixon said pointedly. "Clean slice, then retied to look like the horse did it himself. Professional job." He lowered his voice. "And there was something left behind. A painting, small one." Thomas maintained a neutral expression. "What kind of painting?" Before Dixon could answer, Blackwood's voice boomed from inside the stable. "Find Harlow. Bring him to me." Dixon gripped Thomas's arm. "Whatever you're playing at, you're outmatched. Blackwood doesn't lose." "Everything and everyone loses eventually, John," Thomas replied calmly. "Even empires fall." He turned to see Reynolds and Carter striding toward him, purpose in their steps. "Mr. Blackwood wants a word," Reynolds said, his voice silky with hatred. "I'm sure he does," Thomas replied, allowing himself to be escorted into the stable. Blackwood stood in the empty stall, Thomas's small painting clutched in his hand, rage contorting his features. "You think this is clever? You think I don't see what you're doing?" "I'm merely an artist, Mr. Blackwood," Thomas replied. "Expressing myself is all I have left." Blackwood stepped closer, the painting crumpling in his fist. "Listen carefully, old man. I own this town. I own the water, the land, the law. People like you, broken, useless people, they exist because I allow it." "Is that what you told my daughter before you killed her?" Thomas asked softly. The stable went silent. Even Blackwood's men seemed to hold their breath. "You're delusional," Blackwood said finally, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Your daughter ran off with that half-breed, probably got herself killed in Indian territory." "I found her body," Thomas said, each word precise as a bullet. "In the canyon, but her husband wasn't with her, and the knife wounds matched a very distinctive pattern." Blackwood's face betrayed nothing, but Thomas saw his right hand move unconsciously to cover the scar on his left forearm. "You have until sunset to leave my town," Blackwood said, "or I'll have you committed. Everyone knows you haven't been right since your daughter disappeared. Seeing things, talking nonsense." "See 7 days," Thomas repeated. "I've already taken your horse. Today I take your water, then your sleep, then your name." Blackwood laughed, but the sound was hollow. "You've lost your mind." "No," Thomas said. "I found my purpose." He turned to leave, but Carter blocked his path. "Mr. Blackwood didn't say you could go," the big man growled. Thomas stood his ground. "The law says I can, unless Sheriff Dixon plans to arrest me for painting." Dixon, hovering at the stable entrance, cleared his throat. "No crime's been committed that I can prove, Warren. Can't hold him." Blackwood waved a dismissive hand. "Let him go for now." As Thomas passed, Blackwood added, "I crushed better men than you in the war, Captain. Men who weren't broken old relics." Outside, Thomas paused to let the morning sun warm his face. His hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been in years. As he walked away, he spotted Samuel watching from between two buildings. Those blue eyes, Sarah's eyes, following him intently. Thomas changed direction, moving casually toward the alley where the boy stood. Samuel didn't flee, but waited, serious and still. "Hello, Samuel," Thomas said quietly when he reached the boy. Samuel nodded once. "You got my package?" "I did." Your father made that carving. If the boy was surprised that Thomas had deduced his identity, he didn't show it. Ma said you'd know his work anywhere. Your mother was right, Thomas confirmed, studying the child's face. Sarah's eyes, but James's jawline and dark hair. Why are you here, Samuel? Where is your father? Samuel glanced around before answering. Pa sent me. Said it was time you knew the truth. But he couldn't come himself. Not yet. James is alive. Thomas felt his heart stutter in his chest. Yes, Samuel said, but hurt bad. Blackwood's men found us in the hills 3 years back. They killed Ma. Pa fought. But the boy swallowed hard. They left him for dead. I was hiding, like Ma told me, and Blackwood thinks you're just some orphan boy. Blackwood thinks you're just some orphan boy, Thomas realized. Samuel nodded. Been watching him, learning his secrets. There's more, grandfather. The words sounded strange, unpracticed. In his house, someone's locked up. A woman. A woman, Thomas repeated, his mind racing. Who? Don't know her name, but she screams sometimes, laughs sometimes. Pa said to find you first, then her. Thomas placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. You're brave, Samuel. Your mother would be proud. Pa said you'd help us get justice, Samuel said, his young face solemn. Said you were the most honorable man he ever knew. The words struck Thomas like physical blows. When Sarah first brought James home, a half-Apache woodworker with quiet dignity and skilled hands, Thomas had been cold, distant, trapped in the prejudices of his generation. It had taken months to accept the man his daughter loved, to see beyond his heritage to his character. I wasn't always, Thomas admitted, but I will be now. He knelt to meet the boy's eyes directly. We have 6 more days. Can you show me where you found that carving? Samuel nodded. Tonight, when Blackwood goes to the saloon. Until then, be careful. If Blackwood suspects who you are— I know, Samuel said with a child's grave certainty. He'd kill me like he killed Ma. As Samuel slipped away, Thomas felt a weight settle onto his shoulders. Not the burden of vengeance, but the responsibility of protection. He had a grandson. He had purpose beyond rage, and he had 6 more days to fulfill his promise. That night, as Blackwood held court in the saloon, Samuel led Thomas to a storehouse behind Blackwood's grand home. Using a stolen key, they slipped inside, where moonlight revealed shelves of confiscated property, items taken from those who couldn't pay Blackwood's extortionate water prices or stood in the way of his expanding empire. There, Samuel whispered, pointing to a chest in the corner. Thomas opened it carefully. Inside lay James's tools, the fine chisels and carving knives that had been his pride, along with jewelry, letters, and a blood-stained shawl that Thomas recognized as Sarah's. He keeps trophies, Thomas said, his voice hollow with horror. Like a scalp hunter, Samuel agreed, his young voice too knowing. As they examined the grim collection, a sound from outside froze them both, approaching footsteps and voices. Reynolds and another man. "Don't see why we're checking the storehouse at this hour," the unfamiliar voice complained. "Because Blackwood, spooked by that painting," Reynolds replied, "thinks the old man might try something else." Thomas grabbed Samuel and pulled him behind a large crate as the door creaked open. Reynolds entered, lantern held high, its light sweeping across the shelves. "See nothing," the second man said. Reynolds frowned, moving deeper into the space. "Check behind those crates." Thomas held Samuel close, feeling the boy's heart hammering. They were trapped, with nowhere to run. As the lantern light crept closer, Thomas prepared to confront the men, to create a distraction so Samuel could escape. But the boy moved first, slipping from Thomas's grasp and deliberately knocking over a small metal cup. As it clattered across the floor, Samuel dashed for the shadows on the opposite side of the storehouse. "There!" the second man shouted, both men turning toward the noise. Thomas seized the moment, rising silently and bringing a wooden plank down on Reynolds' companion, dropping him unconscious to the floor. Reynolds spun back, reaching for his gun, but Thomas was already on him. Decades of military training overcoming the disadvantages of age. One sharp blow to Reynolds' throat silenced his cry for help, and a second to his temple sent him crumpling beside his friend. "Samuel," Thomas called softly. The boy emerged from the shadows, eyes wide. "You moved fast." "Not as fast as I once did," Thomas admitted, his hands beginning to shake again as the rush of combat faded. "We need to leave now." They slipped out into the night, making their way down from Blackwood's Hill toward the town below. Behind them, the grand house stood silhouetted against the stars, one upper window illuminated despite the late hour. As they watched, a pale face appeared briefly at the glass. A woman, her features indistinct at this distance, but her posture one of desperation. "That's her," Samuel whispered, "the one who laughs and screams." Thomas stared at the distant figure, a terrible suspicion forming in his mind. "We need to find out who she is." "How?" Samuel asked. Thomas's gaze shifted to the town well in the center of the main street. "Tomorrow we take his water, then we make him talk." Later that night, as the town slept and even the saloon had gone quiet, Thomas approached the well again. This time he carried a small pouch. From it he withdrew a carefully folded paper, one of his sketches showing Sarah's face rendered in watercolors that would dissolve in the well's depths. "Day 2, he whispered, dropping it into the dark water below. "I take your water." Unknown to Thomas, Reynolds had regained consciousness and reported the storehouse incident to Blackwood. Now the powerful man stood at his bedroom window, watching the distant figure at the well eluding him for the first time in years. Behind him, locked in a connecting room, the woman's laughter began again, high-pitched, broken, and terribly familiar. By morning, word had spread through Redemption Valley like wildfire. Blackwood's prize stallion was still missing, and now 2 of his men had been attacked in the storehouse. The town buzzed with speculation, voices hushed whenever Blackwood's remaining loyalists passed by. Something had shifted in the air. A subtle change, like the first breeze before a storm. Thomas Harlow sat at his easel as dawn broke, completing a second small painting, a well with ripples disturbing its surface, and below the water, a woman's face barely visible. He inscribed Day 2 at the bottom, then set it aside to dry. Martha Wilcox arrived at his door as he was finishing breakfast, her normally calm demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "It's working," she whispered, setting down a basket of fresh bread. "People are talking about what?" Thomas asked, though he knew perfectly well. "The well," Martha replied. "Abigail Green swears she saw a face in the water this morning." Then Carson Reed said the same. "By noon, half the town will be claiming the well is haunted." She lowered her voice further. They're saying it's Sarah's ghost, come back for justice." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. The watercolour would have dissolved by now, leaving only traces, enough to suggest a face to those inclined to see one, especially when primed by gossip. "Blackwood?" Martha's expression darkened, furious. "He's doubled the guards at the well, but people are hesitant to draw water. Some are saying it's poisoned." She paused. "Thomas, he's dangerous when cornered. Reynolds is sporting a nasty bruise and telling everyone you're to blame." "Let him talk," Thomas replied calmly. "Words won't change what's coming." Martha studied his face. "You've changed. Your hands aren't shaking anymore." Thomas looked down at his steady fingers. "I have purpose now." "The boy," Martha guessed. "He's not just any child, is he?" "He's my grandson," Thomas confirmed. "Sarah and James's son." Martha's hand flew to her mouth. "Lord above. Does Blackwood know?" "Not yet. And he mustn't find out until we're ready." Thomas rose, gathering his coat. "I need your help, Martha. The woman in Blackwood's house, the one who laughs and screams. Do you know who she might be?" Martha's expression shifted to one of discomfort. "There are rumors, nothing certain. Tell me." "They say," she began hesitantly, "that when Sarah disappeared she wasn't alone. Her friend Eliza was with her. Eliza Collins, Judge Collins's daughter." "I remember Eliza," Thomas said, his brow furrowing. "She and Sarah were inseparable as girls. Eliza went missing the same day. Most folks assumed they'd run off together, maybe to find James, but her body was never found. And Judge Collins dropped his investigation into both disappearances right after Blackwood made a substantial donation to the courthouse building fund." Thomas felt a chill run through him. "You think Blackwood is keeping Eliza prisoner?" "I don't know," Martha admitted. "But Judge Collins retired suddenly last year, moved back east, and sometimes at night people hear sounds from that house." Before Thomas could respond, the door burst open. Samuel stood there, panting, his face pale with urgency. He gasped, "Grandfather." "They're coming for you, Carter and 6 men." Thomas grabbed his coat and a small satchel of supplies he'd prepared. "Martha, take Samuel to McCoy's smithy. Tell him it's time." "What about you?" Martha asked, already ushering Samuel toward the back door. "I'll lead them away from town," Thomas said. "Meet me at sunset at the old mission ruins." Martha nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Be careful, Thomas. This isn't just about justice anymore. It's about survival." As Martha and Samuel slipped out the back, Thomas took one final look at his small cabin, at the painting of Sarah, at the empty space where James's frame had hung, at the life he'd lived in quiet grief for 3 years. Then he stepped onto his porch, just as Carter and his men rounded the bend in the road. "Thomas Harlow," Carter called, his voice carrying across the distance. "Mr. Blackwood wants a word about his storehouse." Thomas stood his ground, letting them approach. "I'm an artist, Carter, not a thief." "Funny," Carter replied without humor. "Reynolds says different. Says you nearly killed him last night." "Reynolds has an active imagination," Thomas said calmly, "much like the townspeople who claim to see faces in the well." Carter's expression hardened. "You're coming with us, old man, one way or another." Thomas noted the men spreading out, attempting to flank him. 7 against 1. Poor odds, even for a man with military experience. But he had geography on his side, and decades of knowledge these hired guns lacked. "I'll save you the trouble," Thomas said, stepping forward with his hands raised. "I'll come peacefully." Carter seemed surprised, but nodded to his men. As they closed in, Thomas allowed them to approach within arm's reach. Then, with a speed that belied his years, he threw a handful of red painter's pigment into Carter's face. The big man bellowed in pain and surprise, momentarily blinded. Thomas used the distraction to dart between two of the other men and sprint toward the dense thicket of mesquite behind his cabin. Gunshots rang out, bullets splintering wood around him, but Thomas moved with purpose, following a game trail only locals knew existed. Behind him, Carter's shouts faded as Thomas navigated the rough terrain with the sure-footedness of a man who had walked these paths 1,000 times. He'd bought himself time, not much, but perhaps enough. By midday, Redemption Valley was in an unprecedented state of tension. Blackwood's men combed the outlying areas for Thomas, while in town, rumors about the well's haunting had reached fever pitch. Several women claimed to have seen Sarah's face in the water, accusing them from the depths. A child swore the water turned red when he tried to drink it. Sheriff Dixon stood helplessly by the well, watching as Blackwood himself arrived with Reynolds at his side. "This is absurd," Blackwood snapped, pushing through the gathered crowd. "It's water, nothing more." To prove his point, he grabbed the ladle hanging beside the well and drew up a dipper full. The crowd fell silent, watching. Blackwood raised the ladle to his lips, but as the water caught the sunlight, several people gasped. For just an instant, a trick of the light surely, a reddish tinge seemed to color the liquid, like blood diffusing through clear water. Blackwood hesitated, then threw the water to the ground in disgust. "This is Harlow's doing. Some kind of dye or paint." "No one's seen Thomas since morning," Dixon pointed out. "Your men chased him into the hills." "He did this before he ran," Blackwood insisted. "He's trying to turn the town against me." An older woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice quavering but determined. "Or maybe it's justice coming for you, Warren Blackwood." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering, subtle but unmistakable. Blackwood's face darkened with rage. "I built this town," he growled. "I brought the railroad. I dug this well when the river dried up. Without me, you'd all be dust and bones." "And without the water, so would you," came another voice. McCoy, the blacksmith, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for speaking plainly. "Perhaps it's time we remembered that water belongs to no man." Blackwood's hand moved to his gun, but even he wasn't foolish enough to draw against a crowd. Instead, he forced a smile that resembled a grimace. "The well is open," he announced. "Free water for today while we resolve this issue." He turned to Reynolds. "Post guards. Nobody touches the well without supervision." As Blackwood strode away, the crowd parted before him, but their eyes followed with something new, speculation rather than fear. Dixon caught up with him at the edge of the street. "This is getting out of hand, Warren," the sheriff said quietly. "Maybe it's time to—" "Time to what?" Blackwood interrupted. "Show weakness. I've buried better men than Thomas Harlow." Dixon paled slightly at the choice of words. "That's not what I meant." "Find him," Blackwood ordered, "before he does more damage." As Blackwood continued toward his mansion on the hill, Dixon remained in the street, torn between duty and conscience. 3 years of looking the other way had worn grooves in his soul, pathways of least resistance that were becoming harder to justify each day. His gaze travelled up to Blackwood's house, to the window where, just for a moment, he thought he saw a pale face watching before a curtain fell back into place. In the cool shadows of McCoy's smithy, Samuel watched intently as the blacksmith examined the piece of carved wood his father had made. "Your paw had a gift," McCoy said appreciatively. "Never seen finer work." "He taught me some," Samuel replied. "Before—" His young voice trailed off. Martha put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Thomas said to tell you it's time. What did he mean?" McCoy nodded gravely, setting aside the carving and moving to a locked chest in the corner of his shop. From it, he withdrew a worn leather journal. "Thomas came to me 3 years ago," the blacksmith explained, "right after Sarah was found. He was half mad with grief, but clear-eyed about one thing. Blackwood was responsible. He asked me to keep this safe. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure the truth came out." Martha took the journal with reverent hands. "What truth?" "That's for Thomas to tell," McCoy said. "But I can say this. Blackwood didn't just kill Sarah. He's been killing this town slowly for years, one soul at a time." A noise outside made them all freeze. McCoy motioned for silence, then carefully approached the window, peering out into the alley. "Reynolds," he whispered, watching the shop. "How did they know?" Martha wondered. "Blackwood has eyes everywhere," McCoy replied grimly. "And now he knows Thomas has allies." Samuel's young face hardened with a determination beyond his years. "We need to warn Grandfather." "We will," McCoy assured him, "but first we need to stay alive." Thomas reached the ruins of the old Spanish mission as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. The crumbling adobe walls provided cover and multiple escape routes if needed. He settled into a defensive position, checking the old army revolver he'd carried since the war. His mind, however, was on Eliza Collins. If she truly was being held prisoner in Blackwood's house, her testimony could be crucial, assuming her mind remained sound after years of captivity. As the shadows lengthened, Thomas heard the soft crunch of approaching footsteps. He raised his gun, only to lower it as Sheriff Dixon stepped into view, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm alone," Dixon said quietly. "For now," Thomas replied, not relaxing his vigilance. "What do you want, John?" Dixon removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "To talk about Sarah, about what really happened." 3 years too late," Thomas said coldly. "I know," Dixon admitted, his shoulders slumping. "I've been a coward, telling myself I was protecting my family by staying silent. But after today, at the well—" He shook his head. "People are starting to question, starting to remember who they were before Blackwood owned everything." Thomas studied his former sergeant closely. John Dixon had been a good soldier once, reliable in a fight, honest to a fault. The man before him now was a shadow of that soldier, worn down by compromise and fear. "You were there," Thomas said. "It wasn't a question." "When Sarah died?" Dixon nodded miserably. "Not when it happened. After, Blackwood called me to the canyon, said there had been an incident. I found Sarah already dead. James badly beaten, unconscious. Eliza Collins was there too, hysterical, trying to help James." "And what did you do?" Thomas asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "What I was told," Dixon replied, shame evident in every word, Blackwood said James had attacked Sarah in a jealous rage, that Eliza had witnessed it. He ordered me to arrest James. But you didn't, Thomas noted, because James wasn't at the jail when I returned to town. Dixon's gaze dropped to the ground. James woke up as we were loading him into the wagon. He broke free, attacked Blackwood, cut him on the arm before Blackwood's men subdued him again. That's when Blackwood changed his mind about the jail. Said James was too dangerous, needed to be handled privately. You let them take him, Thomas said, contempt hardening his voice. I did, Dixon admitted. And Eliza, too, when she tried to intervene. Blackwood said he'd keep her safe until she calmed down enough to testify against James. He looked up, his eyes haunted. I didn't know he meant to keep her forever, or that James would somehow survive. Thomas absorbed this confirmation of his worst suspicions and the truth about Sarah's death. It wasn't James, was it? No, Dixon said quietly. It was Blackwood. Sarah had discovered something. Papers in Judge Collins's office that proved Blackwood had been forging land deeds. She confronted him, threatened exposure, and he killed her for it. Thomas finished the words, bitter as ash in his mouth. Dixon nodded. Blackwood has owned this town for so long, he believes he owns the lives in it too. A noise from the path behind Dixon made both men tense, but it was only Martha emerging from the gathering darkness with Samuel close behind. Thomas, she called softly, relief evident in her voice. Thank God you're safe. Not for lack of trying on Blackwood's part, Thomas replied, holstering his gun and embracing his grandson as the boy ran to him. Reynolds was watching McCoy's shop, Martha explained. We had to take the long way around. McCoy? Dixon asked, surprise evident in his voice. Yes, Sheriff, Martha replied coldly. There are still people in this town with backbones. Dixon accepted the rebuke without protest. I deserve that, but I'm trying to make amends now. Thomas introduced Samuel formally. John, this is my grandson, Samuel Miller, Sarah and James's son. Dixon's eyes widened as he took in the boy's features. Sarah's striking blue eyes in a face that clearly showed his mixed heritage. My God, does Blackwood know? Not yet, Thomas said. And we need to keep it that way until we can free Eliza and find James. James is alive? Dixon asked, hope and dread mingling in his voice. Samuel nodded solemnly. Paws hiding in the hills. Sent me to find grandfather and on to Liza. Martha opened her bag, producing McCoy's journal. Thomas, McCoy said this was important. Thomas took the journal, his expression grim. It's evidence, names, dates, details of Blackwood's land grabs over the years, including Sarah and James's property. He turned to Dixon. With this and Eliza's testimony, we could bring Blackwood to justice legally. Blackwood owns the law in these parts, Dixon reminded him. Not all of it, Thomas countered. Judge Harmon in Silver Creek has no love for Blackwood. If we could get Eliza and this evidence to him... Blackwood would never let you leave town, Dixon warned. He's got men watching every road. Then we bring Harmon here, Thomas decided. But first, we need to get to Eliza. As night fell completely, the small group huddled in the mission ruins, formulating a plan. Thomas spread out a rough map of Redemption Valley on a flat stone. Blackwood's house has 3 entrances, he explained, pointing to each location. Main door, kitchen, and a servant's entrance at the back. Guards are posted at the front and likely patrolling the grounds. Eliza is kept in an upper room on the east side, Samuel added. I've seen her at the window. Dixon studied the map. Getting in is possible. Getting out with Eliza will be the challenge. We'll need a distraction, Thomas mused. Something big enough to draw attention away from the house. Martha's eyes lit with inspiration. The well! Everyone's already on edge about it. If something were to happen there... Thomas nodded slowly. Day 3, I take his sleep. Tomorrow night, Blackwood won't rest, and neither will his men. As they continued planning, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of a collapsed wall. Reynolds, having tracked Martha and Samuel from town. He slipped away silently, eager to report this unexpected gathering to his employer. Blackwood paced the ornate study of his mansion, glass of whiskey in hand, his usual composure fracturing at the edges. The day's events at the well had shaken him more than he cared to admit. For the first time in years, he sensed control slipping through his fingers. A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "Enter!" he barked. Reynolds slipped in, a triumphant smile playing at his lips. "Found him, sir. Thomas Harlow is at the old mission ruins." Blackwood's expression darkened. "Alone?" "No, sir. With the boy who's been doing odd jobs, Martha from the boarding house, and, Reynolds paused for effect. "Sheriff Dixon." "Dixon?" Blackwood repeated, genuine surprise in his voice. "You're certain?" "Saw him with my own eyes," Reynolds confirmed. "Talking with Harlow like old friends. And, sir, there is more. The boy, they're calling him Samuel. He's claiming to be Harlow's grandson, Sarah and James Miller's son." Blackwood went very still, the glass freezing halfway to his lips. "That's impossible. The child would have been an infant when—" He stopped abruptly. "When what, sir?" Reynolds prompted. Blackwood waved the question away, his mind racing. Never mind. What were they discussing? A plan to reach Judge Harmon in Silver Creek. And Reynolds hesitated. "Speak," Blackwood commanded. "They mentioned the woman upstairs said they need to free Eliza." The crystal glass shattered in Blackwood's grip, whiskey and blood mixing on his hand. He barely seemed to notice the injury. "Prepare the men," he ordered, his voice deadly calm. "Tomorrow night, we end this permanently." "All of them?" Reynolds asked, his eyes glittering with anticipation. "All of them?" Blackwood confirmed. "No witnesses, no loose ends." By dawn, Thomas Harlow will be nothing but a memory. As Reynolds departed to carry out his orders, Blackwood moved to the window, looking out over the town that had been his kingdom for so long. In the distance he could just make out the mission ruins, a darker shadow against the night sky. 7 days, he murmured mockingly. "You won't see day 4, old man." From the locked room upstairs came the sound of laughter, high-pitched, broken, and eerily knowing, as if its source could somehow sense the approaching storm. Blackwood tensed, then reached for another glass and the whiskey decanter. Sleep would not come easily tonight, haunted as he was by ghosts, both living and dead. Dawn broke over Redemption Valley with an ominous crimson glow. Thomas Harlow stood at the edge of the mission ruins, watching as the blood-red sun climbed above the eastern hills. His third painting was complete, a stark image of Blackwood's grand house with every window illuminated, shadows of sleepless figures pacing within. Day 3 he had inscribed at the bottom, I take your sleep. Sheriff Dixon approached, hat in hand, his expression troubled. Reynolds was here last night, tracked Martha and Samuel from town. Thomas's face remained impassive, though his heart raced with concern. Then Blackwood knows. Everything, Dixon confirmed grimly. By now, he'll have men positioned throughout town. The roads will be watched. Good, Thomas said, surprising the sheriff. Good, Dixon echoed incredulously. When a man like Blackwood feels cornered, he makes mistakes. Thomas tucked the small painting into his coat. Is McCoy ready? Dixon nodded. He worked through the night, said to tell you it's as good as gospel. Thomas allowed himself a thin smile. And Martha's spreading the word, quiet-like. By noon, half the town will know what's coming. Samuel emerged from the ruins, his young face solemn in the morning light. Despite his tender years, he moved with the cautious deliberation of someone much older, someone who had learned harsh lessons about survival. "Grandfather," he said, "I should go into town first. Nobody pays attention to a boy running errands." Thomas knelt before his grandson, placing weathered hands on the boy's shoulders. "It's too dangerous now, Samuel. Blackwood knows who you are." "Which is why I need to go," Samuel insisted. "They'll be looking for you and Sheriff Dixon, not me. I can get to Anisa, tell her the plan." Dixon and Thomas exchanged troubled glances. The boy was right. He stood a better chance of moving through town unnoticed, but the risk was substantial. "I promised your father I'd keep you safe," Thomas said quietly. Samuel's blue eyes, Sarah's eyes, met his without wavering. Paul also said, "The Millers don't run from fights, not even the hard ones." Thomas felt pride and fear in equal measure. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving, an eagle with outstretched wings that James had made years ago. "Take this," he said, pressing it into Samuel's hand. "Show it to Eliza. She'll know it came from James." Samuel closed his fingers around the carving, nodding solemnly. "I'll be careful. Promise." As the boy slipped away toward town, Thomas turned to Dixon with grim determination. "Let's give Blackwood something else to worry about." By mid-morning, Redemption Valley hummed with tension. Blackwood's men patrolled the streets openly, rifles in hand, stopping townsfolk for questioning. The saloon remained closed, the general store nearly empty as people chose to stay home rather than risk unwanted attention. In his grand house on the hill, Warren Blackwood stood before a mirror, carefully knotting his silk tie, despite eyes reddened from lack of sleep. He had not rested, haunted by visions of Sarah's face in the well, by the knowledge that James Miller's son walked free, carrying with him the truth about that day in the canyon. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter!" he called, smoothing his vest with practiced precision. Carter stepped in, his bruiser's face troubled. "Problem at the livery, sir. Someone broke in last night." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Harlow?" "Can't say for certain," Carter replied. "But your saddle's been taken, the silver-trimmed one." "My father's saddle," Blackwood corrected sharply, a muscle twitching in his jaw. For a moment, raw emotion cracked his composed facade. "Find it now." As Carter departed, Blackwood turned back to the mirror, noticing a single grey hair at his temple that hadn't been there the day before. He plucked it with unnecessary force. From the locked room down the hall came the sound of movement, pacing footsteps. Then a sudden silence, as if the occupant were listening intently. Blackwood's reflection stared back at him, unforgiving in the morning light. The man he saw looked older, somehow diminished, the confident power he'd cultivated like a second skin beginning to fray at the edges. 7 days, he murmured to his reflection. He won't see sunset. Samuel moved through town with practiced inconspicuousness, a skill born of necessity. He kept his head down, his movements purposeful, just another errand boy on a busy morning. Most of Blackwood's men didn't give him a second glance, their eyes searching for Thomas's silver hair, for Dixon's badge, not for a half-Apache child carrying firewood. The grand house loomed above him as he climbed the hill, approaching from the blind side where deliveries were made to the kitchen. He'd worked here once, 2 weeks past, helping the cook haul flour and potatoes from the storeroom. He remembered the layout, the servants' stairs, the unused rooms, the corridor leading to the east wing where Eliza was kept. Slipping through the kitchen entrance while the cook argued with a delivery boy, Samuel moved silently through the house, the bundle of firewood providing his cover. When he reached the east wing, he set the wood down and withdrew a small hairpin Martha had given him. The locked door yielded after a minute of careful manipulation, a trick his father had taught him, though James had surely intended the skill for less perilous applications. As the door swung open, Samuel braced himself for what he might find. Stories of mad women locked in attics had circulated through town for years, embellished with each telling. The reality was both better and worse than he had imagined. Eliza Collins sat by the window, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. At 30, she retained the beauty that had made her the toast of Redemption Valley in her youth, but it was a beauty transformed by suffering. Her dark hair streaked with premature grey, her eyes holding a haunted depth. She turned as the door opened, her expression cautious but not fearful. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Samuel closed the door behind him, heart pounding. "Samuel Miller, ma'am, Sarah's son." Eliza's composure faltered, a tremor running through her slender frame. "Sarah's... not possible. Sarah's baby wasn't due until—" "I was born after," Samuel explained, stepping closer. "After what happened in the canyon, Paw got me away before Blackwood could find us." Eliza's eyes, intelligent despite whatever torment she had endured, studied him intently. "You have her eyes," she whispered finally, "but James's face—" Samuel nodded, relief washing through him. He withdrew the eagle carving from his pocket. "Grandfather sent this. Said you'd recognize it." Eliza took the carving with trembling fingers. "Thomas? He's here?" "Yes, ma'am, and we're going to get you out tonight." A bitter smile touched Eliza's lips. "I've tried to escape 17 times in 3 years, Samuel. This house has become my prison in ways you cannot imagine." "It's different now," Samuel insisted. "Sheriff Dixon is helping us, and Paw's alive, hiding in the hills." This news struck Eliza like a physical blow. She clutched the carving tighter, tears welling in her eyes. "James is alive. All this time I thought... Blackwood said he'd killed him." "Blackwood lies," Samuel said simply. "About everything." Eliza nodded, composing herself with visible effort. "Yes, he does, including about Sarah's death." Her voice hardened. "He killed her, Samuel, when she discovered the forged land deeds in my father's office. I saw it happen." "We know," Samuel assured her. "That's why we're here, to make him pay." Eliza rose from her chair with sudden urgency. "Listen carefully. There's more you don't know. Blackwood isn't just stealing land. He's selling water rights to the mining companies upriver. That's why the drought has been so severe. They're diverting the Redemption River." Samuel absorbed this shocking revelation. "So, even the drought is his doing. Not directly, but he profits from it," Eliza explained. "The documents are in his study, in a safe behind the painting of his father. I've seen him open it when he thought I was sedated." A noise from the hallway silenced them both. Footsteps approached, accompanied by the jingle of keys. "Go," Eliza whispered urgently. The servant stares quickly. Samuel hesitated. "Tonight, when the church bell strikes 9, be ready." Eliza nodded, pressing the eagle carving back into his hands. "Bought this to Thomas. Tell him—" Her voice caught. "Tell him I never stopped fighting." Samuel slipped from the room moments before the door opened from the outside, managing to conceal himself in an unused linen closet. Through the slats he glimpsed Reynolds entering Eliza's room with a tray of food and a small brown bottle. "Time for your medicine, Miss Collins," Reynolds said, his voice falsely solicitous. "I'm not hungry," Eliza replied coolly. "Mr. Blackwood insists," Reynolds countered. "Especially today. You'll want to be rested for tonight's excitement." Samuel's blood ran cold at the veiled threat in Reynolds' words. As soon as the man departed, the boy made his way back through the house, his young mind racing with the urgency of the information he carried. In the blacksmith shop, Thomas and McCoy bent over a large sheet of paper spread across the workbench. Dixon stood watch at the door, his badge conspicuously absent from his chest for the first time in years. "It's perfect," Thomas said, studying the detailed map McCoy had drawn of the water system beneath Redemption Valley. McCoy nodded, his massive hands surprisingly delicate as he traced the underground waterways. "When I helped dig the new well 3 years back, I noticed something strange. The water level was lower than it should have been, given the natural springs in the area." "Blackwood's deal with the mining companies," Dixon suggested. "They're diverting the river upstream." "Worse," McCoy replied grimly. "They're pumping the groundwater too, for the new hydraulic mining operations. That's why the drought hit so hard and so fast." Thomas's expression darkened. "So, while charging double for water from the town well, Blackwood was helping them drain the entire valley." McCoy finished. "Another year of this, and Redemption Valley will be uninhabitable. Everyone will be forced to sell their land for pennies and move on." "Unless we stop him today," Thomas said firmly. The shop door opened and all 3 men tensed, reaching for weapons. But it was only Martha ushering in a breathless Samuel. "The boy's been seen," she warned. "Carter's men are searching the east side of town." Thomas embraced his grandson quickly. "Did you reach Eliza?" Samuel nodded, relaying everything he'd learned. Eliza's condition, the documents in the safe, and the ominous reference to tonight's excitement. "He's planning something," Dixon said, worry creasing his brow. "Moving up his timeline." "Then so must we," Thomas decided. "McCoy, are the charges ready?" The blacksmith nodded. 6 packets, just as you asked. Enough to breach the underground channel without bringing down the whole town." Thomas turned to Martha. "And the message to Judge Harmon?" "Sent with the morning stage," she confirmed. "If all goes well, he'll be here by tomorrow with federal marshals." "If all goes well," Dixon repeated doubtfully. "That's a mighty big if, Thomas." Thomas's steady hands unfurled a larger canvas he'd been working on throughout the morning. A detailed rendering of Blackwood's face, not as he appeared now, but as he would look with defeat etched into every line, with the knowledge of justice about to be served. 3 years ago," Thomas said quietly, "I lost everything I loved because I followed rules while Blackwood made his own." I won't make that mistake again. He rolled up the canvas, securing it with a leather strap. Tonight, Warren Blackwood learns that some debts can never be repaid, only collected. As dusk approached, an unusual calm settled over Redemption Valley. The town held its breath, sensing the gathering storm. Blackwood's men patrolled in pairs, their hands now never far from their weapons, their eyes scanning rooftops and alleyways with increasing unease. In the saloon, reopened by Blackwood's direct order to project an illusion of normalcy, Reynolds nursed a whiskey while keeping watch on the street outside. The few patrons present spoke in hushed tones, conversations dying whenever Blackwood's lieutenant glanced their way. Carter entered, removing his hat and wiping sweat from his brow despite the cooling evening air. "Anything?" Reynolds asked tersely. Carter shook his head. "Vanished like smoke. The old man, the boy, Dixon, all gone." "They haven't left town," Reynolds said with certainty. "Blackwood's got every road covered." "Then where the hell are they?" Reynolds drained his glass. "Underground, most likely. The old mine tunnels run beneath half the town." Carter cursed softly. "Should we tell Blackwood and admit we've lost them?" Reynolds scoffed. "Not if you value your hide." He stood, adjusting his gun belt. "Double the men at the house." "Whatever Harlow's planning, it'll center on Blackwood." As Carter departed to carry out the order, Reynolds moved to the window, staring out at the darkening street. His gaze drifted to the town well, where two of Blackwood's men stood guard, rifles held across their chests. Something glinted in the fading light, a reflection from the roof of the general store opposite. Reynolds squinted, trying to identify the source. Too late. He recognized the small mirror Samuel was using to signal someone across town. By the time Reynolds burst through the saloon doors, the boy had disappeared from the rooftop. "The general store!" Reynolds shouted to the guards at the well. "Check the roof!" As the men ran toward the building, a low rumble vibrated through the street. The guards hesitated, looking around in confusion. As the rumbling grew stronger, dust sifted from between the boards of the sidewalk. Then, with a sound like distant thunder, the ground beneath the well heaved upward. Water erupted in a spectacular geyser, drenching the street and sending the guards scrambling backward in shock. From somewhere nearby, a woman screamed. Reynolds stood transfixed as chaos erupted around him. The controlled explosion had breached one of the underground water channels, releasing pent-up pressure from the diverted river. Water continued to pour forth, turning the main street into a muddy river. In the confusion, none of Blackwood's men noticed the three figures moving purposefully toward the mansion on the hill. Thomas, Dixon, and McCoy, using the diversion exactly as planned. Blackwood was in his study when the first explosion shook the valley. He rushed to the window, watching in disbelief as water fountained from the town well. His composure cracked completely, a roar of rage tearing from his throat as he grabbed his rifle. "Reynolds!" he bellowed, though he knew his lieutenant was in town. "Carter! Damn it!" No response came from within the house. Blackwood moved to his desk, unlocking a drawer to retrieve additional ammunition. His hand closed around the cold steel of a revolver just as the study door burst open. Thomas Harlow stood in the doorway, Dixon and McCoy flanking him. "Hello, Warren," Thomas said calmly. "Trouble sleeping?" Blackwood's rifle snapped up, but Dixon was faster, his service revolver already aimed at Blackwood's chest. "Don't," the former sheriff warned. "You'll be dead before you clear the window." For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, Blackwood lowered the rifle. 3 against 1, he observed, forcing a smile. Not very sporting, Thomas. Neither was murdering my daughter, Thomas replied evenly, or trying to kill my son-in-law, or imprisoning Eliza Collins for 3 years. Blackwood's eyes darted between the 3 men. You have no proof of any of that. We don't need proof, McCoy rumbled. We were there. Vigilante justice, Blackwood sneered. I expected better from a decorated Union captain. Thomas stepped forward, unrolling the canvas he'd carried. This isn't about justice, Warren. It's about truth. The truth you've buried for years, along with anyone who threatened to expose it. He held up the painting. Blackwood's face rendered with unflinching accuracy, every line of cruelty and corruption captured in oils. I've spent 3 years painting you, studying you, learning what made a man like you possible, and I've realized something. And what's that? Blackwood asked, his tone mockingly polite despite the sweat beading on his brow. That men like you are never defeated by justice, Thomas said, only by exposure, by the moment when everyone sees what you truly are. He gestured to Dixon, who withdrew Blackwood's ledger from his coat, the detailed record of bribes, falsified deeds, and water rights sales that Samuel had described. Your empire ends tonight, Thomas continued. Judge Harmon arrives tomorrow with federal marshals. The water rights you sold illegally are being revoked. The land you stole is being returned. Blackwood's facade of confidence cracked. You're bluffing. Harmon would never— He already has, Dixon interrupted, extracting a telegram from his pocket. This arrived this morning. The federal government has been investigating the mining operations for months. Your partners have already implicated you to save themselves. For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Blackwood's face. His hand moved subtly toward the desk drawer where the revolver lay. I wouldn't, McCoy warned, shifting his considerable bulk to block any escape route. Thomas stepped closer, his steady gaze locked with Blackwood's. Where is she, Warren? Where's Eliza? A new voice answered from the doorway, female, weary but determined. I'm here, Eliza Collins said, Samuel at her side. I let myself out. She held up a small key. Reynolds should be more careful where he keeps this. Blackwood's composure shattered completely at the sight of her. You, he spat. You were supposed to be sedated. I learned to fake it years ago, Eliza replied calmly, just as I learned to memorize every document you brought into this house, every conversation you had when you thought I couldn't hear. She stepped into the room, her dignity intact, despite the simple dress and unbound hair that marked her captivity. I am prepared to testify to everything, Warren. Every murder, every theft, every lie. Blackwood lunged then, not for the hidden revolver, but for Eliza, his hands outstretched like claws. Thomas intercepted him, driving a solid fist into Blackwood's midsection with surprising strength for a man his age. As Blackwood doubled over, Dixon stepped forward to restrain him, but Blackwood was not finished. With the desperate strength of a cornered animal, he broke free of Dixon's grasp, reaching once more for his desk. This time, his hand closed around the revolver. "Nobody move!" he shouted, swinging the weapon in a wild arc. The gunshot, when it came, was deafening in the confined space of the study. Blackwood staggered, shock registering on his face as he looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his expensive vest. In the doorway behind Eliza and Samuel stood a figure none of them had expected. James Miller, his once handsome face scarred by old wounds, but his aim still true, the smoking rifle in his hands evidence of his timely intervention. "That," James said quietly, "was for Sarah." Blackwood collapsed to his knees, the revolver falling from his suddenly nerveless fingers. He stared up at James with something like recognition in his fading eyes. You were supposed to be dead," he gasped. "So was the truth," James replied. But some things refused to stay buried. As Blackwood slumped forward onto the expensive carpet, the sound of multiple horses arriving echoed from outside. Reynolds and Carter had returned, along with the rest of Blackwood's men. Thomas moved to the window, his heart sinking as he counted at least a dozen armed figures approaching the house. "We're outnumbered," Dixon observed grimly, checking his ammunition. "Not quite," James countered, a grim smile touching his scarred lips. He raised his hand in a signal toward the surrounding hills. From the darkness emerged more riders, Apache men, their faces painted for war, moving with silent precision to encircle Blackwood's returning forces. "My mother's people," James explained at Thomas's questioning glance. "They've been waiting for this night as long as we have." As the two groups converged outside, tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm, Thomas turned to his reunited family. Eliza, James, and Samuel, brought together by grief and separated by violence, now standing unified in the aftermath of justice. "It's time," Thomas said softly, "to finish what we started." In his pocket, the handkerchief with his 3 tightly tied knots reminded him of his promise. 7 days to reclaim everything Blackwood had stolen. Tonight had seen day 3 fulfilled, Blackwood's sleep permanently interrupted. But the reckoning was far from complete. Outside, the first shots rang out as Blackwood's men discovered they were surrounded. The night erupted into chaos. The final battle for Redemption Valley beginning in earnest as day 3 drew to its bloody close. Gunfire crackled through the night, illuminating the darkness in brief, violent flashes. Thomas Harlow crouched behind an overturned table in Blackwood's study, the ornate furniture offering meager protection as bullets splintered the windowsill above his head. Beside him, James checked his rifle with practiced hands, his scarred face set in grim determination. "We need to reach the east wing," Thomas shouted over the din. "There's a back staircase that leads to the kitchen garden." Dixon, reloading his revolver with trembling fingers, nodded in agreement. "Reynolds will have men at every exit. We're going to need cover." "Samuel and Eliza," Thomas began, concerned, etching deeper lines into his weathered face. "Martha took them through the servants' passage," McCoy assured him, the blacksmith's massive frame wedged awkwardly behind a writing desk. "They'll meet us at the rendezvous point." A momentary lull in the gunfire gave them their chance. James signaled to the others, then led the way into the corridor, his movements fluid despite the old injury that caused him to favor his right leg. Thomas followed closely, his artist's eyes noting how his son-in-law had changed in the years since they'd last seen each other. Harder, leaner, the softness of youth burned away by suffering and survival. They reached the east wing without encountering resistance, the sounds of fighting now concentrated at the front of the mansion. The back staircase loomed ahead, a narrow passage used by servants to move unobtrusively through the grand house. "Wait," Dixon whispered sharply, raising his hand. "Listen." Footsteps approached from below, heavy, purposeful strides that could only belong to Carter. James raised his rifle, but Thomas placed a restraining hand on his arm. "We need him alive," Thomas murmured. "He knows where the rest of Blackwood's men are stationed." The footsteps grew louder. As Carter's broad shoulders filled the stairway, Dixon stepped forward, revolver aimed squarely at the enforcer's chest. "That's far enough," Dixon ordered. "Hands where I can see them." Carter froze, then slowly raised his hands, his expression betraying neither fear nor surprise, only a calculating assessment of his odds. 4 against 1, he observed calmly. "Better than Blackwood got." "Where's Reynolds?" James demanded. A thin smile touched Carter's lips. "Headed to town with 6 men. Said something about loose ends that needed tying." Thomas felt ice form in his veins. Martha, Samuel, and Eliza are headed right for him. "Not just them," Carter added, seemingly unconcerned by his captive status. "Reynolds mentioned the boarding house, said it was time to make an example." McCoy's face paled beneath his beard. "There are women and children there." "Reynolds doesn't make those distinctions," Carter replied. Thomas studied the man before him, a hired gun, a bruiser who had carried out Blackwood's dirty work for years. But there was something in his manner now, a subtle shift that suggested the changing winds had not gone unnoticed. "You don't seem particularly upset about your employer's demise," Thomas noted. Carter shrugged his massive shoulders. "Blackwood paid well, but he wasn't the kind of man who inspired loyalty, not the kind that lasts past death, anyway." "And Reynolds," Dixon pressed. "You're just going to let him burn down half the town?" "Reynolds is a mad dog," Carter said bluntly. "Always has been. Blackwood kept him on a short leash, but with the leash gone—" He made a gesture that needed no interpretation. James stepped forward, his dark eyes boring into Carter's. "If you want to walk away from this, you'll help us stop him." Carter considered this proposition with the pragmatism of a man accustomed to shifting allegiances. "What's in it for me?" "Your life," James replied simply. "And my testimony that you cooperated when Judge Harmon arrives tomorrow." A beat of silence, broken only by the distant sounds of fighting. "There's a faster road to town," Carter decided, lowering his hands slowly. "Through the old mineshaft behind the stables, comes out near the church." Thomas nodded to Dixon, who reluctantly lowered his weapon. "Lead the way, but understand this. If you're leading us into a trap, you won't live to regret it." Carter's expression remained unreadable as he turned toward a side passage. "No trap. Even I have lines I won't cross. Women and children are among them." As they followed him through the darkened corridors of Blackwood's mansion, Thomas felt time pressing down upon him like a physical weight. The 4th day was approaching, the day he had promised to take Blackwood's name. Now, with Blackwood dead, that promise had transformed into something else entirely, a race to protect the innocent before Reynolds could exact his twisted revenge. Samuel crouched behind a stack of crates at the edge of town, his young heart pounding against his ribs. Beside him, Martha kept a protective arm around Eliza, whose strength had begun to flag after the exertion of escape and the fading effects of the laudanum Reynolds had forced upon her. "We need to keep moving," Martha whispered urgently. "The mission ruins are still half a mile away." Samuel peered cautiously around the crates, then quickly drew back as riders passed on the main street, Reynolds and his men moving with grim purpose toward the center of town. "Too late," the boy murmured. "They're between us and the ruins." Eliza straightened, pushing aside Martha's supportive arm. Despite her weakened state, a fierce determination shone in her eyes. "My father's house." "It's closer. and I know where he kept a shotgun." Martha hesitated, glancing at the distant shapes of Reynolds' men spreading through the town. "It's risky. They'll be watching the main streets." "Not the back ways," Samuel said, his voice steady beyond his years. "I know every alley in Redemption Valley, been mapping them in my head since I arrived." Eliza managed a weak smile, recognizing Sarah's determination in her young nephew. "Lead on." The trio moved through the shadows, avoiding the pools of lamplight that spilled from windows and street corners. Samuel navigated with the instinctive sense of direction he'd inherited from his Apache ancestors, leading them through narrow passages between buildings, across small yards, and even through an abandoned storefront whose back door hung on broken hinges. They reached Judge Collins' house, a modest but dignified structure that had stood empty since the judge's abrupt departure without incident. Eliza produced a key from a hiding place beneath a loose brick in the garden wall. "Father always believed in contingencies," she explained softly as she unlocked the rear entrance. Inside, the house stood silent and draped in sheets, furniture shapes looming like ghostly sentinels in the darkness. Dust motes swirled in the thin shafts of moonlight that penetrated the drawn curtains. Eliza moved with certainty, despite her years of absence, leading them to her father's study. With trembling hands, she removed a painting from the wall, revealing a small wall safe. "The combination," she murmured, fingers hovering over the dial. It was... Her brow furrowed in concentration, fighting against the lingering fog of medication. "Your birthday," Samuel suggested quietly. "That's what Pa said the judge used for everything. Month, day, year." Eliza's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with remembrance. "July 16th, 1852, she confirmed, turning the dial with newfound confidence. The safe door swung open, revealing not only the promised shotgun, but also a packet of documents bound in leather and sealed with wax. "What are those?" Martha asked, keeping watch at the study window. "Evidence?" Eliza replied, her voice strengthening as she lifted the packet. Father was building a case against Blackwood. Land deeds, water rights, witness statements about Sarah's murder, everything. He couldn't move against Blackwood directly, not with Blackwood's influence. So he was gathering proof to send to the federal marshals. "Then why did he leave?" Samuel asked, confused. Eliza's expression darkened. "Blackwood threatened me. Said if Father didn't drop the investigation and leave town, I would disappear permanently. Father chose my life over justice." Martha's sharp intake of breath drew their attention. "They're coming," she warned, stepping back from the window. "Reynolds and 2 others, headed straight for us." Eliza clutched the shotgun, her knuckles white against the polished wood. "How did they know?" "They must have been watching the house all along," Martha realized, "in case the judge ever returned." Samuel's young mind worked rapidly, assessing their limited options. "The root cellar," he decided. "Every house this old has one. We can hide there until Grandfather comes." But Eliza stood her ground, raising the shotgun with surprisingly steady hands. "I'm done hiding," she said, a lifetime of captivity hardening her resolve. "Martha, take Samuel and the documents. Get to the church. It's where Thomas would look for us first." "We're not leaving you," Martha protested. "Yes, you are," Eliza insisted. "These documents are more important than any one of us. They're the truth that Sarah died for." The sound of boots on the front porch silenced their argument. Reynolds' voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "Check around back," he ordered. "Mason, with me." Martha made her decision, grabbing Samuel's hand and the packet of documents. "God be with you, Eliza Collins," she whispered, pulling the reluctant boy toward the kitchen and the cellar entrance beyond. Eliza positioned herself at the study door, shotgun raised, a strange calm settling over her features. 3 years of helplessness dissolved in this moment of choice, this reclaiming of her own agency, her own courage. As the front door splintered under Reynolds' boot, Eliza thought of Sarah, of James, of the family that Blackwood had tried to destroy. She would not fail them. "Now come on, then," she murmured to herself. "Let's finish what you started." Thomas, James, Dixon, and McCoy emerged from the abandoned mineshaft near the church, guided by Carter through the labyrinthine tunnels that honeycombed the earth beneath Redemption Valley. The night air felt cool against their dust-covered faces as they climbed free of the subterranean passage. "Town's too quiet," James observed, his hunter's senses alert to the unnatural stillness. Dixon nodded in agreement. "Reynolds would have raised the alarm by now," gathered Blackwood's loyalists. "Unless he doesn't want witnesses," Carter suggested grimly. "Reynolds prefers to work without an audience." Thomas scanned the darkened streets, his artist's eye picking out subtle movements, shifts in shadow. The boarding house is 2 blocks east. The mission ruins to the north. Where would Martha take them? "The church," James decided, gesturing toward the simple wooden steeple that rose above the surrounding buildings. "Sanctuary. It's what Sarah would want." They made their choice. Before anyone could react, a shotgun's roar ripped through the stillness of the night. It was a sound so distinctive, so utterly unmistakable, that it seemed to glue everyone to the spot. "That came from the west side," McCoy declared, hoisting his blacksmith's hammer a bit higher. "Judge Collins's house." Thomas and James exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding and growing dread. Without uttering a single word, they bolted into a run, Dixon and McCoy right on their heels. Carter hesitated for just a moment before joining them, drawing his revolver as he ran. They were halfway to the judge's house when a second shot echoed, quickly followed by a man's piercing scream of pain. Then everything went silent. Thomas pushed his aging body as far as it could go, ignoring the sharp protests of his joints and the fiery burn in his lungs. James easily outpaced him. Years spent in the wilderness had honed his already impressive strength and speed, making him a force to be reckoned with. As they rounded the corner onto Oak Street, they saw Reynolds and another man hauling a struggling figure out of the judge's house. It was Eliza, her dress torn, a bloody gash marking her forehead, but still fighting back with fierce determination. James raised his rifle ready to fire, but Dixon grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Too risky," Dixon said. "You might hit Eliza." Reynolds spotted them at that exact moment, shoving Eliza toward his accomplice and drawing his own weapon in one swift, fluid motion. The first bullet whistled past Thomas's ear, dangerously close. The second slammed into the wooden post beside James. "Get down!" Carter yelled, returning fire from behind the relative safety of a water trough. The street exploded into a chaotic exchange of gunfire. Reynolds and his man dove for cover behind the judge's porch, using Eliza as a human shield. Dixon and Carter laid down suppressing fire, while James stealthily worked his way around through the neighboring yards, searching for a better angle. Thomas found momentary shelter behind a stack of barrels when he caught Eliza's eye across the distance. Despite her captivity, despite the blood trickling down her face, she gave him a small but significant nod toward the rear entrance of the house. The message was crystal clear. Someone was still inside. Using the ongoing gunfight as cover, Thomas slipped away from the main confrontation, circling behind the adjacent property to approach the judge's house from the back. The kitchen door stood slightly ajar, swinging gently in the night breeze. Thomas entered cautiously, revolver drawn, every sense straining for any sign of danger. The house was still and eerily silent. The sounds of the gunfight were muffled by the thick walls. "Samuel," he called out softly. "Martha." A barely perceptible creak from below answered him, the cellar door slowly creaking open. Samuel emerged first, his young face streaked with dust and tears, but his blue eyes clear and focused. Martha followed close behind, clutching a leather packet tightly to her chest. "Grandfather," Samuel whispered, rushing into Thomas's embrace. "Are you hurt?" Thomas asked urgently, quickly checking the boy for any injuries. "No, but Auntie Eliza—" "I know," Thomas said grimly. "James and the others are trying to help her now." Martha stepped forward, holding out the packet. "Eliza found these in the judge's safe," she said. "She said they're the evidence her father was gathering against Blackwood. Everything we need to prove what he did to Sarah and James." Thomas took the packet, feeling its weight in his hands, the physical manifestation of a truth that had long been buried. This was what Blackwood had feared most. Not necessarily justice itself, but the stark exposure of his crimes. A sudden crash from outside, followed by intensified gunfire, jolted them back into action. "We need to get these documents to safety," Thomas decided. "Samuel, show Martha the way to the church through the back streets. I'll join the others and help Eliza." Samuel's face hardened into stubborn lines, so reminiscent of Sarah that it made Thomas's heart clench. "I'm staying with you," the boy insisted. "They need me. I can help. I know this house, all its hiding places." Thomas recognized the futility of arguing with him. The Miller determination ran too deep in the boy's blood. "Stay close, then," Thomas conceded. "And if I say run, you run. No questions." As Martha slipped away with the precious documents, Thomas and Samuel moved toward the front of the house, guided by the sounds of the continuing battle. Through a side window, they caught a glimpse of the scene unfolding in the street. James had somehow managed to work his way onto the roof of the neighboring building and now had a clear shot at Reynolds, while Dixon, McCoy and, surprisingly, Carter maintained pressure from their original positions. Reynolds, realizing his disadvantage, had dragged Eliza into the judge's front parlor, using the house itself as a fortress. His remaining man lay motionless on the porch steps, a growing pool of dark liquid spreading beneath him. "There's a way in," Samuel whispered, tugging at Thomas's sleeve. "Through Father's study, a hidden panel that connects to the parlor. Judge Collins showed it to Father once. He said it was from the days when the house served as a stop on the Underground Railroad." Thomas followed his grandson through the darkened house to the judge's study, where Samuel immediately went to the fireplace. With practiced movements, he pressed a sequence of decorative tiles on the mantelpiece. A section of wall beside the fireplace swung inward silently, revealing a narrow passage. "It leads behind the parlor bookcase," Samuel explained. "We can surprise Reynolds from behind." Thomas marveled at the boy's courage, even as he worried deeply for his safety. "I'll go first," he insisted. "You follow only when I signal it's safe." The passage was tight, designed for escaping slaves, not aging artists. But Thomas managed to navigate its confines, emerging behind a bookcase that stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see Reynolds pacing the parlour, dragging Eliza with him, his revolver pressed against her temple. "It's over, Reynolds," James called from outside. "Blackwood is dead. Let her go, and you might live to see morning." Reynolds laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You think I care about Blackwood?" he sneered. "He was just a means to an end. This was never about him. It was about power. Who has it and who doesn't?" "And now you don't," Eliza said defiantly, despite her precarious position. "You're finished in Redemption Valley?" "Maybe," Reynolds conceded, tightening his grip on her arm, "but I'll have the satisfaction of taking you and Harlow with me." Thomas eased the bookcase open further, careful to avoid making any noise. Reynolds stood with his back to him, his attention focused on the windows and doors where he expected an attack. Taking a deep breath, Thomas prepared to rush forward, but a floorboard creaked beneath his weight, the sound impossibly loud in the tense silence. Reynolds spun around, dragging Eliza with him, his revolver swinging toward the source of the noise. But in turning, he momentarily loosened his grip on Eliza. She drove her elbow into his ribs with all her remaining strength, creating just enough space to wrench herself partially free. Thomas fired in the same instant, his bullet grazing Reynolds' shoulder. The lieutenant staggered, but didn't fall, returning fire with wild inaccuracy. The first shot went wide. The second struck Thomas in the upper arm, spinning him against the bookcase. As Thomas struggled to maintain his footing, Samuel burst from the hidden passage, throwing himself at Reynolds with the reckless courage of youth. The impact was enough to disrupt Reynolds's aim as he prepared to fire again at Thomas, sending the bullet into the ceiling instead. "Samuel, no!" Thomas shouted, raising his weapon again, despite the blood flowing down his arm. Reynolds snarled, striking the boy with savage force, sending him sprawling. He turned his revolver towards Samuel, rage contorting his features into something barely human. "You should have run when you had the chance, boy," Reynolds growled. Before he could pull the trigger, the parlour window exploded inward as James crashed through in a shower of glass, his body colliding with Reynolds in a tangle of limbs and fury. The two men grappled for control of the revolver, rolling across the floor in a deadly struggle. Thomas moved to help, but his injured arm betrayed him, the revolver slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers. He watched in helpless horror as Reynolds gained the upper hand, slamming James's wrist against the edge of a heavy table until the rifle fell from his grasp. As Reynolds raised his revolver for a killing shot, a new figure entered through the shattered window. Carter, his own weapon aimed with unwavering precision. "That's enough," Carter said, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. Reynolds froze, disbelief written across his face. You're with them now?" "I told you," Carter replied steadily. "Women and children. That's my line." For a heartbeat, the tableau held. James pinned beneath Reynolds, Samuel recovering his senses nearby, Thomas leaning heavily against the bookcase, Eliza braced against the wall, and Carter in the window frame, his revolver trained on his former comrade. Then Reynolds made his choice, swinging his weapon toward Carter with snake-like speed. The two shots were almost simultaneous. Reynolds' bullet grazed Carter's cheek, while Carter struck with deadly accuracy, his bullet entering Reynolds's chest just above the heart. Reynolds toppled backward, his finger spasming on the trigger once more as he fell. The wild shot found its mark in the ceiling's support beam, sending a shower of plaster and dust raining down as the ancient structure groaned in protest. "The house is coming down," Carter warned, holstering his weapon and moving to help Eliza. "We need to move now." James scrambled to his feet, gathering Samuel in his arms, while Thomas retrieved his fallen revolver. As they staggered toward the door, the ceiling gave way above Reynolds' lifeless form, burying him beneath timber and plaster in a fitting tomb. They emerged onto the porch, just as Dixon and McCoy arrived, having circled around during the confrontation. Together, they retreated across the street as the judge's house, a repository of so many secrets, collapsed in on itself with a thunderous roar. In the sudden quiet that followed, Thomas became aware of the town awakening around them. Lights were appearing in windows, cautious faces peering from doorways, drawn by the sounds of conflict and destruction. And from the direction of the church came Martha, accompanied by several townspeople armed with makeshift weapons, ready to defend their own against Reynolds's threatened violence. "Is it over?" Martha asked, her gaze taking in their battered condition, lingering with particular concern on Thomas's bloodied arm. Thomas looked at his reunited family, James holding Samuel close, Eliza leaning against Carter's supportive shoulder, Dixon and McCoy standing guard, and the gathering townspeople emerging from fear into resolve. "Not quite," Thomas replied, thinking of his promise. 7 days to take everything Blackwood had stolen. 3 days had passed. The 4th was dawning, the eastern sky already lightening with the promise of morning. "Day 4, he murmured. "I take his name." As if in answer, the church bell began to toll the hour, the sound rolling across Redemption Valley like a pronouncement, a declaration that the time for secrets and shadows had passed. The 4th day had begun, and with it, the reckoning that would transform not just a name, but an entire town. Dawn broke over Redemption Valley with an almost apologetic gentleness, golden light washing over the rubble of Judge Collins's house, illuminating the aftermath of the night's violence. Thomas Harlow sat on the church steps as Martha tended to his wounded arm, binding it with clean strips of linen. Despite the pain, his hands remained steady, his gaze fixed on the gathering crowd in the town square. News travelled swiftly in small towns, especially news of Warren Blackwood's death. By sunrise, nearly every resident had assembled, their faces displaying emotions that ranged from cautious hope to outright disbelief. Some carried weapons, uncertain whether the danger had truly passed. Others brought food and coffee, the instinctive response of frontier communities to crisis. Thomas watched as James moved among them, explaining what had happened, his scarred face and quiet dignity lending weight to his words. Samuel stayed close to his father's side, occasionally adding details with a child's blunt honesty. The townspeople listened, initially skeptical, then increasingly outraged as the full extent of Blackwood's crimes became clear. "That should hold until Doc Williams can look at it properly," Martha said, securing the bandage around Thomas's arm. "You're lucky the bullet went clean through." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Thomas replied with a faint smile. "Reynolds was always a better businessman than marksman." Martha's expression sobered. "What happens now? Thomas, Blackwood's gone, but his influence extended far beyond Redemption Valley. There will be repercussions." Thomas nodded gravely. "That's why we need to act quickly. Day 4 has begun." He rose, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his wound, and made his way to where Dixon stood with McCoy and, surprisingly, Carter. The former enforcer had remained with them through the night, his decision to side against Reynolds seeming to surprise even himself. "Judge Harmon should arrive by noon," Dixon was saying as Thomas joined them, "if the telegraph went through." "It did," McCoy confirmed. "Got confirmation back last night before all this started." Thomas addressed Carter directly. "You still planning to testify about Blackwood's operations?" Carter met his gaze without flinching. "A deal's a deal. Besides, there's nothing left to protect. Blackwood's dead. Reynolds too. The only person looking out for Carter now is Carter." "Fair enough," Thomas acknowledged. "We'll need your knowledge of Blackwood's records. Who he bribed, who he threatened, where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively." Carter's expression remained impassive. "I know where he kept the real ledgers, not in the house. He wasn't that foolish. There's a hidden compartment in his private office at the bank." "Then that's our next stop," Thomas decided, "before anyone loyal to Blackwood can destroy the evidence." As they prepared to move, Eliza approached, her wounded forehead now bandaged, her bearing dignified despite the ordeal she had endured. She carried the leather packet of documents recovered from her father's safe. "There's something you should see first," she said, extracting a folded paper from among the legal documents. "It's a letter from my father, written before he left town. I found it last night, but didn't have time to share it." Thomas took the letter, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was precise, methodical, the penmanship of a man accustomed to legal documentation. "My dearest Eliza," it began, "if you are reading this, then my worst fears and greatest hopes have both been realized. You have escaped Blackwood's clutches, but I am no longer there to protect you." Thomas continued reading aloud, his voice steady despite the gravity of the words. "What I could not tell you, what I dared not put into words while Blackwood held you hostage, was that I did not abandon the fight when I left Redemption Valley. I took copies of all the evidence with me to Washington, where I have been working with federal authorities to build a case against Blackwood and his mining associates. The investigation has moved slowly, hampered by Blackwood's political connections, but progress has been made. By the time you read this, federal marshals should be en route, not just to arrest Blackwood, but to dismantle his entire operation. I entrust these original documents to you now as insurance. Should anything happen to delay justice through official channels, these papers contain everything needed to expose Blackwood's crimes, from the murder of Sarah Miller to the illegal diversion of the Redemption River. Know that I have never stopped fighting for you, my daughter, nor for the truth that Blackwood tried to bury. With love and faith in your strength, your father." A respectful silence followed as Thomas refolded the letter. Eliza's eyes shone with unshed tears. "He never abandoned me," she said softly. "All this time I thought he'd chosen safety over justice." "He chose both," Thomas replied, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "And his work is about to bear fruit." The distant sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the eastern road. A cloud of dust marked the arrival of riders too many for Blackwood's remaining men, moving with the disciplined formation of lawmen rather than mercenaries. "The marshals," Dixon breathed, relief evident in his voice. "Judge Harmon must be with them." As the riders entered town, the crowd parted, revealing a column of federal marshals led by a distinguished gentleman in a black coat. Judge Harmon dismounted with the careful movements of a man in his 60s, his sharp eyes taking in the gathered townspeople, the collapsed remains of Judge Collins's house, and finally Thomas Harlow standing on the church steps. "Captain Harlow," Harmon called, approaching with an extended hand. "Your telegram suggested urgency, but I see we may have arrived too late for the main event." "Not too late, Your Honor," Thomas replied, clasping the judge's hand firmly. "Just in time for justice." The next few hours passed in a blur of official documentation and sworn statements. Judge Harmon established a temporary court in the church, methodically recording testimony from Thomas, James, Eliza, and dozens of townspeople who came forward with accounts of Blackwood's abuses. Carter, true to his word, led marshals to the hidden compartment in Blackwood's bank office, where they recovered ledgers documenting years of bribery, extortion, and fraud. The evidence painted a damning picture, not just of Blackwood himself, but of an entire network of corruption that extended to territorial officials and mining executives. By midday, telegraph wires hummed with messages to Washington, while marshals rode out to arrest Blackwood's associates in neighboring towns. Redemption Valley itself seemed to exhale collectively, as if the weight of years had finally lifted. Thomas found a moment of quiet reflection as he stood before the town well, now flowing freely after McCoy's strategic explosions had broken through the underground barriers created by the mining operations. And Samuel joined him, the boy's face thoughtful as he watched townspeople fill buckets without paying the extortionate fees Blackwood had demanded. "Is it really over, grandfather?" Samuel asked. Thomas considered the question with the care it deserved. "Blackwood's reign is over," he said finally, "but the work of rebuilding what he destroyed is just beginning." "Father says we might stay," Samuel ventured. "He says there's honest work to be done here now." Thomas felt a surge of hope at these words. "I'd like that very much, Samuel." "He also says—" The boy hesitated, then pushed on with characteristic determination, "that he'd like to finish the marriage properly this time, with your blessing." Thomas turned to find James standing a few paces away, Eliza beside him. The look that passed between them spoke of healing and possibility, wounds acknowledged but not defining. "James," Thomas began, extending his hand to his son-in-law, "I was wrong about many things 3 years ago. I judged too quickly and listened too little. If my blessing means anything after all that's happened, you have it completely." James clasped Thomas's hand, emotion evident in his usually stoic features. "It means everything," he said simply. A commotion near the church interrupted their moment of reconciliation. Judge Harmon had emerged onto the steps, raising his hands for attention as the townspeople gathered. "Citizens of Redemption Valley," the judge announced, his voice carrying with practiced authority. "Having reviewed the evidence presented today, I am issuing immediate federal orders regarding the governance of this town and the surrounding territory." A hush fell over the crowd as Harmon continued. "First, all lands illegally acquired by Warren Blackwood are hereby returned to their rightful owners, with compensation to be determined for improvements or damages. Second, the diversion of the Redemption River by mining interests is ordered to cease immediately, with substantial penalties to be levied against the responsible companies." Murmurs of approval rippled through the gathering, growing louder as Harmon proceeded. "Third, given the extent of corruption revealed in local government, I am appointing an interim council to oversee town affairs until proper elections can be held." Harmon gestured to where Thomas, James, Dixon, Martha, and McCoy stood. These citizens have demonstrated remarkable courage in exposing Blackwood's crimes. With their consent, I would entrust them with guiding Redemption Valley through this transition. The crowd's response was immediate and enthusiastic, cheers and applause echoing across the square. Thomas found himself momentarily overwhelmed by the display, his artist soul more accustomed to solitude than public acclamation. But as he looked at the faces around him, at James and Samuel, at Eliza beginning to smile again despite her ordeal, at Martha and McCoy, who had risked everything to stand with them, Thomas recognized that this moment wasn't about him. It was about the truth finally emerging into the light after years in darkness. "We accept," Thomas called to Judge Harmon, speaking for all of them after brief nods of confirmation. "With one condition." Harmon raised an eyebrow. "And what would that be, Captain Harlow?" Thomas gestured toward the town sign that still proclaimed Redemption Valley, founded by Warren Blackwood, 1875. "The name," Thomas said clearly. "Blackwood's name should no longer hang over this town or its people." A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd. Harmon nodded thoughtfully. "A reasonable request." "Have you a proposal for a new name?" Thomas hadn't expected the question to fall to him. He considered for a moment, then looked to James and Samuel, to the land around them, to the faces of the people reclaiming their dignity after years of submission. "Truth Valley," Thomas suggested, "because truth, once buried, will always find its way back to the light." The proposal met with nods of approval, but it was Eliza who stepped forward with an alternative. "If I may," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word, "I would suggest Justice Springs for the water that flows beneath us, for the justice that has finally come, and for the new beginning we all seek." The crowd's response made clear their preference. Judge Harmon smiled, making a note in his ledger. "Justice Springs it is," he declared, "a fitting name for a town reborn." As the excitement bubbled through the gathering, Thomas quietly withdrew, making his way back to his small cabin at the edge of town. He needed solitude, if only briefly, to process all that had occurred in the past 4 days. His home showed signs of hasty departure, the door still ajar, breakfast dishes unwashed on the table. But it was the painting of Sarah that drew his attention, still hanging on the wall where it had watched over his grief for 3 years. Thomas stood before it, studying his daughter's young face, the bright eyes that Samuel had inherited, the determined set of her jaw that James still carried in his own way. "We did it, Sarah," he whispered. "We brought him down. We took back everything he stole, your land, your justice, even your husband and son." From his pocket he withdrew the handkerchief with its 4 knotted ends. One by one he untied them, each representing a promise fulfilled. Blackwood's horse, Blackwood's water, Blackwood's sleep, Blackwood's name. The 4th knot came undone in his fingers, the fabric falling loose just as the door creaked behind him. Thomas turned to find Carter standing in the doorway, unwieldy discomfort evident in his usually impassive features. "Judge Harmon's finished taking my statement," Carter said without preamble. "I'm cleared to leave town, provided I don't venture into territorial jurisdiction again." Thomas studied the man who had been Blackwood's enforcer, who had stood by during countless acts of cruelty, yet had ultimately helped save Samuel and Eliza. "Where will you go?" Thomas asked. Carter shrugged his massive shoulders. "Worth, maybe Canada, somewhere people don't know the name Blackwood." Or Carter, Thomas added perceptively. A ghost of a smile touched Carter's lips. The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing the big man's sentiments. Something along those lines. Thomas moved to his easel. There, the small painting labelled Day 4 still stood, depicting Blackwood's mansion engulfed in flames, while the town sign crumbled into dust at 13644. "Take this," Thomas said, offering the painting to Carter as a reminder that even the most powerful men eventually fall. Carter accepted the painting with a surprising gentleness, considering the violence his hands had wrought. "Strange thing," he mused aloud. "Worked for Blackwood 7 years, and I never knew he could be beaten until you came along with your brushes and your knots." "It wasn't the brushes," Thomas replied with conviction. "It was the truth. Truth has a power all its own." After Carter's departure, Thomas remained in his cabin at 13714, preparing a larger canvas for what was shaping up to be his most significant work in years. As the afternoon light faded into evening, he worked steadily, his wounded arm protesting from time to time, but his hands remaining firm and sure. The painting slowly took shape beneath his brush, not a single portrait, but a triptych depicting Redemption Valley's transformation into Justice Springs. The left panel showed the town under Blackwood's oppressive shadow, the figures of its inhabitants bent and diminished. The center panel captured the confrontation, the moment of reckoning at 13743, and the right panel, still mostly blank, waited patiently to depict the future yet to be written. A knock at the door interrupted his work. James stood there, Samuel at his side, both cleaned up from the previous night's ordeal. "Martha's hosting a gathering at the boarding house," James explained. "The whole town's turning out. Judge Harmon says it's important for people to come together to mark the ending of one chapter and the beginning of another." Thomas looked down at his paint-stained hands, then at the unfinished canvas at 13809. "I'll join you shortly. There's something I need to complete first." After they left, Thomas returned to his painting, focusing intently on the third panel, the future of Justice Springs. He added figures standing tall and erect, water flowing freely through the town center, and a new building rising where Blackwood's bank had once stood. In the foreground of this final panel, Thomas painted a family, James and Eliza, hand in hand, Samuel between them and slightly apart, at 13837, an older man with silver hair and steady hands watching over them all. When he finally stepped back, the triptych told a complete story, not just of Blackwood's downfall, but of a community's rebirth. Thomas signed it simply, 7 days, TT, Harlow, 1885. The boarding house was overflowing with townsfolk when Thomas arrived, conversations buzzing with an energy that had been absent from Redemption Valley for far too long. Martha had transformed the dining room into an impromptu banquet hall, the tables laden with whatever food people could contribute. Judge Harmon stood deep in conversation at 13910 with Dixon and several marshals, mapping out the legal proceedings that would continue in the coming weeks. McCoy served drinks with surprising grace for a man of his considerable size, while Eliza moved among the gathered citizens, reconnecting with people she had known before her captivity. Thomas found James and Samuel near the hearth, the boy excitedly recounting some detail of the previous night's adventure to a wide-eyed group of children. "He's got Sarah's gift for storytelling," Thomas observed at 13937 as he joined his son-in-law. James nodded, pride evident in his expression. And your eye for detail. He wants to learn to paint." "I'd be honored to teach him," Thomas replied, a warmth spreading through him at the thought of passing his art on to a new generation. Judge Harmon called for attention, raising a glass in the center of the room. The crowd quieted, turning toward the distinguished jurist. "Friends, we've gathered tonight not just to celebrate the end of Warren Blackwood's tyranny at 14005, but to honor those who stood against him when such opposition seemed utterly futile. Thomas Harlow, who promised to reclaim everything Blackwood had stolen and kept that promise despite overwhelming odds. James Miller, who survived unspeakable violence to return and protect his family. Eliza Collins, whose courage during years of captivity never wavered." The judge continued, acknowledging Martha, McCoy, Dixon, and even Carter, who stood uncomfortably at the edge of the gathering, clearly planning his departure once the formalities concluded at 1:40:35. But beyond individual acts of heroism, Harmon concluded, we celebrate a community finding its voice again. Justice Springs is born today, not by official decree, but by the collective will of its citizens to build something better from the ashes of corruption. Glasses were raised throughout the room, voices joining in a toast that felt more like a covenant than a mere celebration. To Justice Springs. As the evening progressed, Thomas found himself drawn outside to the boarding house porch. The night was clear at 1:41:09, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds on black cloth. The town below had already begun to transform. The sign bearing Blackwood's name had been removed. The well flowed freely in the square, and lights burned in homes where darkness had prevailed for too long. Samuel joined him on the porch, the boy's perceptive eyes noting his grandfather's contemplative mood. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked, leaning against the railing. Thomas smiled gently. "About time at 1:41:36, Samuel. How it bends and shapes us. 3 years ago I thought my life was finished when we lost your mother. Now I find myself with a future I never imagined." Samuel considered this with a child's direct wisdom. "Pa says sometimes the best pictures come from the canvases you thought were ruined." Thomas laughed softly at the apt metaphor. "Your father is a wise man." "He also says," Samuel added more hesitantly, "that we should rebuild our house where it used to be, on the land Blackwood took at 1:42:08. He wants to know if you'd like to build your studio there too, so we could be together." Thomas felt something shift within him, the final piece of a long, fragmented heart finding its place. "I would like that very much, Samuel." Inside the boarding house, someone had started playing a fiddle, a hopeful, lilting tune that drifted through the open window. Couples began to dance, their shadows moving across the lamplight, spilling onto the street below. "What happens tomorrow, grandfather?" Samuel asked, the events of the past days clearly weighing on his young mind at 1:42:38. Thomas placed an arm around his grandson's shoulders, drawing him close. "Tomorrow we begin day 5, not for vengeance anymore, but for rebuilding." As if to punctuate his words, a shooting star traced a brilliant path across the night sky, momentarily outshining all others before fading into memory. "Make a wish," Samuel whispered, the child in him emerging despite all he had witnessed. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, not wishing at 1:43:08, but promising to himself, to Sarah's memory, to the family that remained, and to the town now reborn as Justice Springs. When he opened them again, the future stretched before him like a blank canvas, waiting for the first brush stroke. "Come!" he said to Samuel, turning toward the door where music and laughter beckoned. "Let's join the others." The story is just beginning. Inside, James and Eliza had joined the dancing, their movements tentative at first, then gaining confidence as they rediscovered joy long thought lost at 1:43:36. Martha directed children in distributing sweet cakes she had somehow found time to bake. Dixon and McCoy raised glasses with Judge Harmon, planning for tomorrow, even as they celebrated today. Thomas paused in the doorway, committing the scene to memory with an artist's precision. The play of light and shadow, the expressions of hope where fear had ruled for so long, the first brushstrokes of Justice Springs writing themselves across the human canvas before him. 7 days to take back everything Blackwood had stolen. 4 days complete, with 3 yet to come at 1:44:07. But those days would be different now, days of creation rather than destruction, of healing rather than vengeance. Thomas Harlow stepped across the threshold, steady hands reaching out to embrace the future that awaited them all. The end.